Welcome to the fifth video in the series on Cybis Porcelain. Thank you for joining me to learn more about the history of what was one of America's most fascinating companies and certainly the premier porcelain art studio in the United States. The 1960s signaled change in many ways for the studio. With ownership having passed to Marilyn Charlton with the death of Margus Cybis, the challenge of taking the studio to the next level was met with enthusiasm. In 1960, Marilyn and her husband Joseph Charlton made plans to continue improving the artistic quality of the sculptures Cybis was introducing. After success with the previous freelance items designed by Laszlo Espanki, the decision was made to bring Espanki on board with Cybis as the chief designer. Espanki, an extremely talented and prolific artist, was undeniably a master of porcelain art. He was later honored with the title of the Living Master by galleries, merchants, and collectors alike. More than 90 pieces introduced by Cybis are attributed to Mr. Espanki, with Espanki creating new sculptures in a variety of subject content from religious pieces to birds, flowers, people, and animals. Marilyn and Joe could focus more on sales and marketing. They now had stunning new designs and demand was rising. The drive to expand that market by becoming more widely known became a key business focus. A variety of marketing tactics would yield great success. So far, no Cybis marketing materials have surfaced with the date prior to 1963. It's likely there were price lists, brochures, and perhaps even catalogs produced prior to that year. Examples of sales catalogs for Corday exist, so it's possible at least similar publications were produced for the Cybis line during the 1950s. To date, none have been found. The 1963 price list is a trifold brochure. The copy is in black and white with a picture on the cover of Espanki's flight into Egypt, a religious piece which was released in 1960. Dated spring 1963, we know the studio had at this point introduced the practice of publishing seasonal price lists, as was the practice through the early 1990s. The price list also indicates the studio was changing the way they intended to market their products by organizing sculptures in categories. With the introduction of the Turtle Doves of Peace in 1957, Cybis began offering limited editions. As is apparent from the price list, limited editions initially was an exclusive category of its own, with exclusive pricing. All other items were sold as open, unnumbered editions. And it should be noted the price list groups items of similar subject content together under headings such as animals, birds, decorative accessories, and religious items. By the mid-1960s, this practice was halted, and price lists became a single sheet with limited editions printed on the front and non-limited editions on the back. In both categories, while no headings are included, sculptures are still grouped together according to subject content. Those basic groups were separated by blank lines, and they represented birds, animals, flowers, people, and religious subject matter. By 1974, Cybis had finalized the major categories that were largely used until regular productions ceased at the studio in the early 2000s. Those major categories were Animal Kingdom, Biblical, Birds and Flowers, Children to Cherish, Portraits in Porcelain, Caprice, Circus, and Fantasia. Minor categories were introduced and retired over the years. And while the look and design of the price lists and brochures and catalogs saw ongoing changes, the basic categories stayed the same. As the 1960s progressed, the marketing material increased and became more sophisticated. This was certainly evident with the studio's return to the New York World's Fair in 1964. This marketing decision was an ingenious idea. Cybis was represented in the Pavilion of American Interiors. A spectacular exhibit was staged that dazzled attendees with a tasteful, yet very modern and elegant presentation. It exposed exquisite Cybis porcelain sculptures to people from all 50 states and around the world. A small black and white trifold leaflet picturing the baby owl on the front, ballerina on cue on the back, and the limited edition dahlia flower inside was distributed in the exhibit free of charge. Making its debut at the 1964 World's Fair was also a commemorative black and white catalog which sold for $1. The catalog included information about Boleslaw, the art of porcelain making, brief biographies of a few of the major contributors employed at Cybis, and 45 pictures of items offered for sale in 1964. The catalog would subsequently be revised, adding new introductions annually from 1965 to 1968. Of the 45 items pictured in the commemorative issue, 6 sculptures were items still being produced using Holland or Atlantic molds, but the majority of the items pictured had been created by Laszlo Espanki, with the Turtle Doves of Peace having been created by Marilyn Charlton and the House of Gold Madonna by Harry Berger. The Holy Child of Prague was jointly created by various artists contributing to the finished product. Not pictured in the catalog was another joint effort among the artists of Cybis. The 50 States floral bouquet was produced as a commemorative work exclusively for the World's Fair. While Espanki, as chief designer, oversaw the creation of this spectacular floral arrangement in porcelain, several artists participated in sculpting individual pieces that made up the entire bouquet. This piece alone was a stunning marketing tool which sat on display for the duration of the fair. It was a work to prove none of the studio's crosstown rivals were able to compete with the magnificent works being released by Cybis. While later publications stated the bouquet was one of a kind, there were actually at least 2 of these porcelain floral arrangements produced. Due to the potential for loss, the studio never made only one of anything. In the case of the flower bouquet of the United States, the studio's own promotional photography confirmed more than one had been made. Photographs show 2 bouquets of different content. A black and white photo published in the book Cybis in Retrospect shows a bouquet with butterflies and differing arrangement of various flowers, while the color picture in the 1979 catalog shows a similar piece with no butterflies and missing flowers or containing items not included in the black and white picture. Clearly, there were 2 bouquets produced. Was the first a test or initial prototype that lost out to the second and final version? It was a well-kept secret that was never revealed by the studio, as statements printed in their catalogs declare the copy on display was the only one of its kind produced and was later donated to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. The bouquet is currently in the Smithsonian's archives and not on display for public viewing. An image can be found on the Smithsonian's website. Oddly enough, that picture shows a different wood base than pictured in the Cybis photographs. A few other subtle differences can be noted on close examination. The bouquet was not donated to the Smithsonian until 1968, 3 years after the fair closed in 1965. It's likely the bouquet went back to Trenton after the fair, where it was retrofitted with a new base and quite possibly some restorations. Transporting this piece from Trenton to New York and back would have been nerve-wracking if not a nightmare. It could be considered a miracle if it made the trip with no damage considering its size. Measurements listed in the Cybis catalog state it was 36 inches tall by 40 inches wide. It was huge by comparison to anything else the studio had ever produced. Oddly enough, the Smithsonian's records give measurements as being 29 inches tall by 26 inches wide. Since the piece is not available for public viewing in Washington, it's a mystery that will likely never be solved. Regardless of which piece was on display at the fair, it would have been a spectacular creation that certainly captivated well-heeled attendees, encouraging them to inquire about the studio and current items in production. $1 for a catalog showing the objects of art available from Cybis was a bargain, even in 1964. Whether extremely late in 1963 or early in 1964, Espanki created another commemorative piece which Cybis never produced for sale. With the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, the United States grieved. Espanki produced a tall sculpture of a man raising one hand in disbelief while covering his face with the other. This was a fitting recognition of the pain and sorrow so many felt. However, it's likely it was decided it would not be appropriate to sell an item that could be perceived as a move to capitalize on a tragic event. The sculpture was shelved among the studio's archives until it was sold at auction in 2013. The number on the back of the sculpture was number 1. It's not known how many were made, and it is possible that other copies exist. If multiple copies were produced, it's possible that they were given as special gifts by the studio under unique circumstances. This piece was never listed on any Cybis publications, and no other online auction records have been found for the sale of another copy. Espanki produced numerous sculptures during his 6 years with Cybis, many of which were categorized as prototypes and never released. Early on, he produced a number of contemporary items, of only which a few were released. These items didn't sell well. This was a costly experiment for the studio as they tested their buyers' appetites for modern designs. 3 pieces, Exodus, The Prophet, and Flight into Egypt, were all released in 1960 as limited editions. It took 6 years to sell 50 copies of Exodus, 9 years to sell 50 copies of The Prophet, and 10 years to sell 50 copies of Flight into Egypt, which had originally had a declared issue of 750. Obviously, that number was significantly reduced. On the other hand, Espanki's traditional works sold well and sold fast. By comparison, Moses the Great Lawgiver was introduced in 1963 and sold 750 copies, the entire declared edition, in 7 years. It was painfully obvious to the studio what collectors wanted. Going forward, all of Espanki's designs selected for introduction were those with broad appeal and none of contemporary design. Laszlo left Cybis in 1965, subsequently starting his own studio. During his years with Cybis, additional talent had joined the studio, and this eased the transition as Cybis still had in-house artists and leveraged freelance work by other capable artists as well. The second half of the 1960s was a time of continued expansion and growth as name recognition increased and Cybis picked up national sales reps who introduced their line to finer stores across the continent. They also affiliated with showrooms in the major gift markets of Dallas, Atlanta, Chicago, and New York. In these showrooms, many upscale merchants discovered Cybis, signed contracts with the studio, and began introducing fine porcelain art to Americans throughout the United States. While individual merchants carried Cybis and their line in the mid-sized U.S. cities, Cybis was now being sold by high-end stores like Neiman Marcus in Dallas, Marshall Field's in Chicago, and Bailey Banks and Biddle in Philadelphia. Cybis would continue to expand its name recognition and market share throughout the 1960s. New sculptures were introduced at regular intervals, and the Cybis mystique continued to fascinate new buyers across the United States. They would close out the decade by quickly working to develop a new design to commemorate the 1969 Apollo 11 moon mission, a piece that did not reach the market until early 1970. Titled Tranquility Base, only 111 copies were produced, with the edition fully subscribed and sold out in 1 year. The company ended the 1960s in a strong position, and the success of the Tranquility indicated 1970 and forward would be better than ever. Cybis had developed a unique appeal among a broad range of collectors, and this positioned them well for moving into the next decade. It would be a decade of possibilities and opportunities, including the U.S. bicentennial, an explosion in the collectibles market, and expanded wealth for Americans looking to own the porcelain arts. Thank you for joining me in this episode to look back at another fascinating chapter in the history of the Cybis Porcelain Studio. To learn more about individual Cybis sculptures and additional details about the studio, visit the Cybis Archive online at cybisarchive.com. It's the only comprehensive website online, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the visit. Thanks again, and I look forward to sharing more with you again in the next episode.